to the final bend, the home straight of WFS Europe. It is where the football industry meets, and what I love about this is that, loads of conversations going on. Please do now take your seats, guys, if you're going to attend this next round table. And I think what's been really interesting is that football has this natural tendency, this ambition, this desire to move and move forward. We could have been very much licking our wounds after COVID and concentrating very much on the present. There is an absolute value in that. But the natural tendency is to think forward. And that's what I've noticed as a general theme. How are we going to move forward? How are we going to shape things for the better, building back better? It's an opportunity. That hiatus, that headspace, using that to maybe do something differently. The world of sport, I sense, is now accustomed to constantly addressing whatever the next challenge is, whatever the next crisis may be. Use that word advisedly, challenges perhaps better, especially after what we've gone through over the last 18 months. We're into 2021, we're almost into 2022, and the future of sports governance is a topic in very sharp, acutely sharp focus. It's time to gather a greater understanding of top-level decisions taken by sports federations, governing bodies, people in authority. And there's been no better time to really focus on how you act ethically, again, for the good of the game and for the good of the world, full stop. And that's in sport no different to how it is in life. And the two hold together what we call integrity in sport. So let's welcome our moderator and speakers for this panel. Moderating the session for us, partner at Sheridan's, Daniel Gay, please come to the stage. And also our stellar set of speakers, the Chief Legal and Compliance Officer at FIFA, Emilio Garcia Silvero, the CEO at the PFA, and a good friend of mine as well, Maeta Molango, and Director Global Policy and Strategic Relations, Women's Football at FIFPro, Sarah Gregorius. Please welcome them to the stage, everyone. Daniel, great to see you. Emilio, bienvenido. Muy bien. Love to see you, Sarah. Maeta. Señor. Daniel, floor is yours.
Thank you very much, David. Good afternoon, everybody. Firstly, thank you for coming back after the lunch break. It's much appreciated. I'm going to try and make the session as lively and as interesting as possible. It might be difficult when you hear the word governance for a lively and interesting session, but I promise we're going to do our best. So we have 4 panelists, we have 3 lawyers, we have 2 elite footballers, and we have 1 very average amateur footballer. Emilio, I'm not sure about yourself, but I think you're a good footballer.
Former goalkeeper, but very bad.
So when we think about governance, the topics that have come up, even in discussion over the last 18 months, have been groundbreaking, have been all-encompassing, and have really sometimes shaken football to its very roots. And so before we go on to some of the topics, if it's international calendar, World Cup, financial fair play, on a variety of Super League matters as well, all of those types of things encompass governance. What I'd like just to turn to Emilio at first instance and ask, if you can tell us about the relatively recent FIFA journey from a governance and compliance perspective.
Thanks, Daniel. First of all, I have to clarify that in Spain, this is the siesta time. It's not talking about governance, it's also siesta time, so it's even more challenging. So when it comes to the questions of governance and the FIFA's journey since 2015, well, I think that we all know the story. So in 2015, FIFA was very close to being indicted by the Department of Justice in the United States. We were a very toxic brand at that time. And since 2015, we are making progress. Obviously, FIFA is not a perfect organization, but we are making progress. So we amend the statutes, we implement compliance programs. So, we are looking at the money coming out. So, I think that we achieved a lot over the last 6 years. And one of these examples and rewarded this recent agreement with the Department of Justice. So, before 2015, FIFA was attacked by some of the individuals. And thank God now in 2021, so we have achieved this agreement, and we see $200 million coming back to football with CONMEBOL, with CONCACAF, and we will have the pleasure to invest this money all around the world in football projects. So again, we have a difficult path ahead of us, but making progress over the last 6 years, definitely.
Thanks for that. And I know we're going to talk a bit about the DOJ agreement in a little bit of detail afterwards, which I think is going to be a very interesting one, because I think that's something that I think FIFA have done very well, which is change the narrative, which is it's not FIFA per se, but it's individuals within FIFA.
That's the reality. That's the reality. It was not the company. So like we say in Latin, no, societas delinquere non potest. No, it's not the company, it's the individuals. And we had very bad individuals in the past. I think that we have a completely different group right now, that we are honest, they are honest, so we are fully committed to develop football all around the world, and thanks to this experience and the last 6 years, we achieved this.
Sarah, if I can turn to you next, if that's okay. We've had some great discussions earlier this afternoon on a variety of different topics. One of the issues that we were talking about was the way that now with your role in FIFA Pro and as an ex-player as well, the role of players generally as substantive stakeholders in the governance ecosystem. I know that may sound like a very boring sentence, but actually it's pretty multifaceted. If you could just explain actually some of your role that you're involved in, what you actually think actually that means for current players, for past players, and yeah, have a little bit of detail on that front.
Yeah, for sure, I'll do my best. I think it's easy to describe the importance of players and governance structures and their representation and how that should be mandated and obviously put into place, because a lot of the decisions that are made in football fundamentally do impact players. I mean, obviously the things you touched on earlier, which I'm sure we'll get to later on, and if you are so profoundly impacted by decisions being made, but you don't have a collective representation or a voice in that process, that's where you lead to like real exploitation of players. And it is very difficult to have labour restrictions imposed on you in some regards without actually having your voice represented. And then obviously your access to, I guess, dispute resolution is also lost as well. So I think that the inherent danger that I see in my role when you don't have players involved in governance and in that collective decision-making process is the exploitation of them as workers. And that's the battle that we fight and that Maheta and the PFA fight along with all of our other labour unions around the world, is genuine exploitation can take place to real extremes like human rights violations as well. So it just ends up creating an environment for exploitation. And that's why the presence of players and their representatives in governance is so important, because the absence of it is where a lot of the dangers in the sport can take place.
If I can just ask one extra question for you just at this time, which is, and it maybe fits in with some of the questions, Maheta, I'm going to ask you in a second as well. Why hasn't it always been this way? And are there any particular reasons that you've seen, obviously, again, with your experience as a player, and players needing a voice in the global game, why that hasn't necessarily always been the case?
I think, to be honest, I can be quite cynical because of my experience, not just as a player, but as a woman, it's deliberate in a lot of situations. They just do not want to hear that opinion, and they do not want to then feel accountable to making sure that those issues and those needs are being met in the decisions that are being made. And so I genuinely think it's deliberate. And it's also interesting, what I found in my personal experience as well, is when players are involved in the process around how the decisions are being made, they have skin in the game. So they actually can help you build an environment where they buy into the decisions that are being made, and they help carry them through because they've been part of that process. So I think it's also a little bit sometimes organisations and governing bodies not really understanding that if you involve the players, it can be of huge benefit to the overall sustainability of actually seeing these decisions through, because they are automatically invested in the process and they're automatically invested in the outcome.
It's a great point, and one that leads quite nicely on, Maheta, to obviously the role that you've taken on from the 1st of July, if I recall correctly. I listened to a fantastic podcast that I'd really recommend that Maheta gave with Matt Slater and Mark Chapman from The Athletic relatively recently, where actually the main topics on discussion were the sea change, really, I would say, in the culture to a degree of the PFA, and a lot of that encompassed a number of governance topics, actually. If it's the different boards, the diversity of the boards, and actually the process that ended with you as the main role at the PFA. Would it be possible just to articulate some of those governance issues that have firstly historically been the case for the PFA that to a degree, I guess, have been remedied very early on in your stewardship?
Yeah, sure. I think as Emilio was touching upon and Sarah, I think society is evolving, things are changing. The PFA is the oldest trade union, sports union in the world, but obviously you need to evolve with time. No? And I think what we found is we needed to embark into a transformational journey from two perspectives. The first one, acknowledging that this generation of player is different. They have a voice, they know they have a voice, they have a platform, they care. So it's not just about talking for the sake of talking, they actually care. And we had a great example in the UK about that, Marcus Rashford, Jordan Henderson. So we felt that as a union, what we needed to do first is putting back the center, so the players at the center of the project. So we created a players board, basically with two reps per category, Premier League, Championship, League 1 and 2, and WSL, the Women's Super League. So that increased diversity, it increased make the player part of the decision process. But then we said, well, to be a player is not enough. You know about the game, but one thing is to know about the game, different thing is to run an organization. It takes different skills. So we thought it would be important to complement that players board with an operational board. Who sits on that operational board? 4 non-executive directors who come from Amazon Web Services, TikTok, Commonwealth Game, former Secretary General of the Turkish Association. So we felt we need to complement the voice of the player with some expertise outside of the football, because we need to think in a different way. So I think we're right now, I think, at the forefront of governance, of being creative in terms of how you include the players, but acknowledge that this voice, which is a strong voice, need to be complemented with expertise about how you run an organization, because the PFA is an organization which needs to be run according to those principles.
And one other point that I was fascinated in is that quite early on, you spoke with a variety of different players all across the country, and you were asking them about what their priorities were, in a way, for then to shape your foundations of what you are then going to collectively articulate to the wider ecosystem. Could you set out what some of those priorities from the discussions you had and how that's going to come together in a different way?
Well, it was interesting because when I joined the PFA, the first question was, what is your manifesto? And I said, just to be clear, I'm not a politician. I wasn't elected based on the manifesto. That was a selective process with 90 candidates. So it's just the approach is just different. This is not about politics. It's about us understanding what the players want and convert these ideas into something tangible. So what did I do? I embarked into a tour to go and see every single dressing room, to actually meet the players and just introduce myself and understand what their priority was. And it's very interesting because in the end people say, well, what does a Premier League player have in common with a League 2 player? And one of the things that they have in common is that when they stop playing, they need to work. 99% because of money and 1% because of purpose. So that was a theme. Another theme was, clearly we played too many games. So that was a very recurrent topic in the various, And I was saying to them, well, as you can see, there are topics that you cannot solve on your own individually, as Sarah was saying. So I think if you would have gone to a Premier League dressing room about 18 months ago, they would have said, why do I need a union if I'm making so many millions a year and I'm okay? Well, because you find out that there are stuff that you cannot solve on your own. Financial fair play, online abuse, racism, and so on, number of games that you play, the VAR. So it was refreshing to go to an Arsenal and see an Aubameyang nodding, or to go to Man U and talking to Pogba and see him nodding, or to go to Mata, who's a smart guy, and say, well, that's right. And we think that the union can be helpful for us because we understand the strength of the collective voice versus me picking my individual fight with my Instagram account.
And I think one other thing, just based on my experiences briefly as well, working with a lot of players, is the the diversity of view and the empathy, I guess, that you will bring to the table as a relatively recent ex-player, multilingual, that can share your experiences in different languages. Perhaps maybe they may think that you are closer to them, to be able to feel comfortable to share the issues that are impacting on them as well. That's not for you to agree with or disagree, but that's from my feedback sometimes that I have had over the last few months as well.
No, you're right. I mean, language makes wonders. So if you and I go to Malaysia, we don't speak the local language, but we both speak in English, even if at home we'd never be friends, we're gonna be friends. Because we have something in common with language. And it was just very striking to me to go and meet people I had never met before, or maybe negotiate stuff, but never kind of actually had interaction. Just the language just opens a different type of communication. Hopefully we can be a bit more relatable to those players, because they can see in us something closer to their reality.
Sarah, if we can just briefly, before Emiliano we get discussing again, we discussed as well beforehand about governance issues, and a phrase that you touched on, which I was really interested in articulating in more detail, if that's okay. You talked about the need for ethical stakeholder governance across the game. And we had a discussion beforehand where you were explaining that to me in some detail that I wasn't quite fully aware of. Would you be able to articulate that in a bit more detail too?
Sure, for the folks at home. Yes, so this is the way that we approach it at FIFA, and certainly my point of view. At the moment, we have one governance structure in football, FIFA, for example, but there are, particularly for us representing workers as trade unions, there's two industries. There's a men's football industry and a women's football industry, but we share a governance structure. Within those two industries are two distinct sets of workers, two distinct sets of players. It's not as if you play one day for Arsenal men's and the following weekend you play for Arsenal women's team. Although I think, from what I hear, they wouldn't mind borrowing the striker from the women's team at the moment. She's on fire. But that means that we have very distinct differences in the industries. Obviously, the tradition behind the men's football industry is not present in the women's football industry, but we come under the same governance structure. So the obligation, not just the obligation, but the responsibility of that governance structure to make sure that it's looking after and representing the interests of both industries is really important. It's more than just an obligation. It's more than just putting women's football as item number 12 on the to-do list and saying, oh, now we better get to it at, 4:45 before everyone's rushing home for the end of the day. So that is really important to establish that is the current structure and the current model that we're operating under. So that's why it's so important to obviously, and Heta and I are obviously biased in this point of view, but why it's so important to have knowledge and experience in both of those industries if you're going to govern both of those industries. To me, that's ethical stakeholder governance, is actually being representative of the needs and the issues of both industries that you're governing over. And then the other part of that, which is less about ethical stakeholder governance and more about high-performance governance, is not only just having women representing women's football. Yes, you need to make sure that their issues are represented, and at the moment it probably means that you're going to have someone from the women's football community within the governance structure. But it's actually saying men and women in governance, anyone in governance has a responsibility, an equal responsibility over the people that they govern. So it's making sure that you have people that can speak and represent on the different topics, but that's not where your responsibility begins and ends. And you don't all of a sudden turn around and say, hey, where did that lady go? We need to have her tell us about women's football. No, you have to go out and get that knowledge and that experience of the matter if you don't come from the community itself. And then that's not even having the conversation about the fact that we know that when there is diversity in leadership, you actually get better business. And that's really, I think, something that we have to be really critical of ourselves in that regard, is we're not actually, as an industry, governed in a high-performance manner where you have diversity in thought and diversity in leadership, because you know that it means that you're making better decisions. There's tons of research out there. You don't need me to sit in this chair and tell you and educate. You can go out and Google the Deloitte analysis on that topic and find it out in very, very detailed ways. So it's also looking at ethical stakeholder governance, and high-performance leadership. And I think we're still, if we're being brutally honest, and obviously looking around at a summit like this and you see that it's actually not the diverse crowd in the world, you know that we're maybe perhaps further away from it than what other industries, certainly best practice where they're at. And I think sport and football in general needs to think not just what we need to shift, but actually how far behind we are from like industry best practice standards across the board.
May I just ask one very quick additional question on that, which is, I think we all know maybe in the medium to long term what the aims and objectives should be for diversity. There was a great book called Rebel Ideas by Matthew Syed that I really enjoyed on exactly that point. What are the short-term actions that you think can be inputted to be able to address that? I know obviously there's always going to be that longer-term push, but is there something here and now, inside 6 months, inside a year, that is actually tangible that you can hold on to and say, this is what we should be doing right this second?
Sure, I think it's really simple. You cannot monitor what you don't measure. So if you don't actually establish what diversity is, what equality is, what inclusion looks like and feels like, you cannot monitor it. And so I think sometimes we get caught up in like trying to quickly get to the end, but we haven't actually done the groundwork of figuring out what it is that we're trying to measure and what we're going to monitor in the future. So my challenge always to organizations is, what does diversity really mean for you? We have to do that. We're a global organization. What diversity means for the English PFA is not going to be the same as what it means for the Player Association in Gabon, for example. So figure out what it is for you. Figure out what it is that you are going to measure and what you are going to monitor, and then put the strategy in place. But if you don't take that first step, you can't start having conversations about medium to long term. And again, that is going to require transparency, accountability, and probably vulnerability as well. Be honest with where you're at in the journey so at least you can start it.
Great answer. Emilio, if I can turn to you now, if that's okay. We're going to get into the juicy topics now, I promise, that we said in the beginning. Not too juicy, don't worry. The two things we were going to touch on were a little bit more detail about the DOJ agreement, because I think that's a really interesting one, especially because all of the repatriated monies, I understand, is going to a particular fund, and I'd be very interested to hear about that. And as a second point also, which is an issue close to my heart to a degree because of the players and the agents that I work with sometimes, it'd be fascinating to hear maybe the latest on the agents' re-regulation, if possible, as well. But whichever order you want to take it in. Okay,
let's start with the second point. As you know, the FIFA Council, and the FIFA Football Stakeholders Committee approved some principles 2 years ago concerning agents, principles about licensing, education, disputes, cap on commission, transparency, FIFA clearinghouse, etc., etc., etc. So since then, we are working on it. So we consulted different groups, not only group of agents, that there are a lot of group of agents all around the world, not only in Europe, in South America, Central America, Asia, Africa. So, I think that this is the third, fourth, fifth, sixth round of consultation with group of agents. We're also working with FIPRO, at the Football Stakeholders Committee, the clubs, the leagues. I think that my feeling is that we are very close, and we should expect something in the next months. So my personal opinion is that, the FIFA Council should approve these regulations before the end of the year. These regulations should come into force as from 1st July 2022. But again, FIFA is not the old FIFA, it's the new FIFA. So, we talk with players, with clubs, with leagues, with agents. It takes time, so you need to gather different views and then issue the regulations. But more or less, this is the timeline. So, we should expect something in 2022, definitely.
And if I can ask just one quick question, an update on that. I presume because at various conferences over the last year or so, different agents at different times have criticized FIFA's approach to, for example, the commission cap. Is that something that you feel is still resolvable, or do you feel that that is something that will escalate once the implementation occurs?
it will depend on the scope of the term resolve. If you can resolve something, we are always open to consider different approaches and different proposals, and we are working with the agents as well since the beginning. So the principles are there. Of course, in life, you have to take decisions. When I joined UEFA a long time ago and we started working on financial fair play, I was there, so they started talking about, this is illegal against EU law, antitrust law, we will challenge this in court, you will lose the case. After 10 years, after 15 years, the regulations are still there and in good shape, I could say. So this is more or less the same with agents. So we have a clear idea about what to do. We would like to consult all the groups around football, and then we will take the final decision. And if someone is dissatisfied, obviously they should go to court. They can go to the Court of Arbitration for Sport, and if they think that this is the case, they can go to ordinary court. So the most important thing for us is that what we do is right and fair and proportionate, definitely. That's the thing. So if we are convinced that what we are doing is correct, we are lawyers, we can see you in court. I would prefer to solve this in advance, and we are working in this direction, and this is the idea.
And if I can quickly now turn on, again, Emilio, on the DOJ side of things, because obviously working with the Department of Justice must have been a fascinating experience for you. I can only speak when I was doing my antitrust work in the aviation sectors, for example, on all of the cartel matters in that front. But your experiences of dealing with the DOJ, of the significant monies that now are being repatriated to FIFA for particular projects, I'd be fascinated in your views there too.
No, it has been 3 fantastic years flying to New York very often. So meeting the prosecutors and trying to convince them that, again, we are working in a different direction. We have a strong compliance program, so we monitor our finance and we do our best to change the face of the company. Again, 3 years, very often there, so with many meetings. So, I still remember the first one when you arrive in New York, you go to the meeting room and, we start with the introductions. This is Mr. from FBI, this is Mr. from FBI, this is a prosecutor, so maybe, this is a dangerous place. But my experience has been fantastic during these 3 years with CONMEBOL, with CONCACAF working in the same direction, and then finally we reached this agreement, and we're very much looking forward to start working in this fund and spending money all around the world for the benefits of those who deserve these projects and money, definitely.
Maheta, if I can turn back to you, if that's okay now. One of the areas, as part of your discussion that you were having on the podcast and we've had beforehand, related now effectively to the PFA being one of the strongest player voices in sport, and obviously, having real sway in the football industry generally. Without obviously going into too much detail, or as much detail as you're able to provide, we talked about there not being a manifesto, completely understood. Are there particular priorities for the PFA? I can maybe talk about some of the issues that have come up recently that you've talked about, which is the World Cup issues, or UEFA, for example, thinking about changes to their FFP regime that maybe we can talk in more detail of. The dementia issue, which I know you've spoken to a lot of the families about previously as well. It seems like there's a whole host of quite varied topics that you are going to be right in the middle of, which sounds very interesting, actually.
Yeah, it's fascinating and certainly not as frightening as your meetings in the US. So certainly more exciting. No, obviously we can cover a lot of things. I think life is a matter of priorities and trying to understand what do the players see as a priority for them. But I think conceptually, we're really keen to kind of reposition the role of the players as it should be. i.e., if we want to protect and to grow the product football, what my kids need to see on the pitch is the best version of their idols. And I think we're very concerned about the fact that, so it needs to start by that. So we need to say, okay, what is the maximum of days that a human being can humanly sustain to be able to perform at the best level? And then work backwards. So if the answer is a human being cannot play more than X amount of days, then let's establish that amount of day and work backwards, because our concern is that in the end, if some people will look at football as a passion, as a sport, and other people look at this as a business. That's the reality. Now, no matter if you look at this from a romantic sports perspective or you look at this from a business perspective, the reality is that if we want to compete against other entertainment sources, we need to give the fans the best version of the players. So I think it's very important. We're really keen to reposition ourselves as what we are, a union. And I think the players are not just one more stakeholder. The players are at the heart of it. This is what everyone has in common, because without them, we're done. I had this experience myself as a chief exec of a club. I had great ideas, but I had to acknowledge that without those 11 guys, I was nothing. There was no point in me having great strategies, because if they do not buy into what I'm doing, I'm done.
I tell you, Maita, I've never understood the term stakeholders. To tell you the truth, I don't know what stakeholders means in English. Honestly, we use stakeholders, but for me it's completely strange. So obviously players are part of football, part of the institution, no?
No, you're right. And at the same time, I think one of the things which I found fascinating about the PFA is that they've always been at the forefront of key issues. For example, now one of the debates that we have in England is, does heading the ball cause brain damage, which then will become dementia? This is a topic which is not touched upon in other jurisdictions, and we're pushing for that. We're advocating on behalf of those families who are suffering to try to establish a link, try to do research, try to not only look back, but also look forward. So, for example, we just approved some groundbreaking regulation about limiting the number of head balls during a training session. This is groundbreaking, and we're very proud to be part of that discussion. But equally, for example, in the topic about EDI, discrimination, online abuse, we're very proud to take the lead in terms of showing that the social media can do much more, that you can identify the people who actually make those comments, and you can go to the police, you can go to the clubs, because we were able, so we did a report with a company called Signify, which has enabled us to assess about between 6 and 7 million posts. And the conclusion was you can do two things. One, block the comments automatically. And second, you are able to hold accountable the person who made that comment. So I think this is what we see as a priority in terms of us leading the line at a strategic level. What is the role of the players? What is the role of the players on the social media? How can you use the social media for what it should be used, as a powerful loudspeaker for change? But you need to go there in a safe way. So we could be talking about a number of topics, but I think those three topics, which is understanding that the players are not any stakeholder. I'm not a native English speaker either, but for me it's not any stakeholder. This is the stakeholder of the industry. And then I think leading the line in things which are strategically important for the sector. Maybe online abuse, maybe dementia, maybe other things which are important.
If I can maybe just ask one follow-up question on that, which is international calendar and 2 yearly World Cup discussions, obviously. There's talk, at least reports, that there's going to be more substantive discussions with the PFA and FIFPro and other players' unions soon, if by the end of the month or otherwise. Does the PFA have an outline view on that so far? Is that something that's in active discussions?
Look, what I'm seeing is that obviously, what the players see is 30+% of the players who took part in the European Championship, and I think the last World Cup, if I'm not mistaken, came from England. So they're saying, well, this is 30+% of people contributing to 2 competitions. And they're saying to me, well, we think we need to be part of that discussion. I think we need to understand what is going on, and I think we're feeling that there's a willingness to engage in that, no? But again, I think it goes back to the concept, Are we really making the most to try to protect the product? Forget about the interest of one, the other, etc. We are competing against other entertainment options. And if we continue down that path of just seeing the shadow version of the best players, then people lose interest. And they'll go to other sources of entertainment. In the end, we will all suffer from that. So would love to be able in a position to be part of that conversation, obviously through the right channels, as FIFA is the case, but also sparking a discussion as to how do we grow and protect the game that we love. Is it right that we have games every day? That it gets to a stage where you're even bored of watching games. I love football, I get bored. It's saturation of football. Does this benefit other industries? So I think we need to see the bigger picture, not just the little kind of interest of each of us, players, club, federation, etc., but seeing the bigger picture, and hopefully FIFA and us can spark that discussion about is it really the best thing for the game that we love?
Sarah, if I might come to you last, if that's okay, because I've been told we're almost out of time, so thank you in advance for the great interaction. Do you have any, does you or FIFA have any particular views on, obviously I know that there was, you were involved in a women's study in relation to particular types of loads and player loads in the past. Going forward on obviously women's and men's game, obviously FIFA are going to be right at the heart of that. Does FIFA have a position as yet, or is that something that obviously will evolve during that consultation period?
On the biennial World Cups, for example, I think, again, this is a panel on governance, right? So you have to look at why we're having this conversation, why it's going the way that it's going, and not only in the public domain, but through this consultation process with FIFA as well. And again, if you think about decision-making processes and the fundamental part of the population that it will impact, and if you decide to start to make decisions, I mean, also there's a huge difference between consultation and decision-making. They can be very, very far apart, and you can have very differing approaches. You can have genuine consultation that can influence decision-making, or you can have very tokenistic consultation and the decision's already been made. So I think it's a bit of a micro example of a broader problem around like the difference between decision-making and consultation. And if you have a decision that's being made that so profoundly affects a certain group, being the players, being the ones that we represent, and you haven't legitimately involved them in the process, then it's not a legitimate outcome. So I would even be stronger than the answer that Maheta gave. I think it delegitimizes the process to exclude the group that is so profoundly impacted by the decision. And we can have lots of studies and conversations about workload, and there are natural physiological limits to what the players can do. And if you're trying to grow the sport and grow the game sustainably as a product, but also as an employment environment for players, you can't rinse them with competitions and games. And actually, play as many games as you like, but it might get to the point where you just have to limit how many an individual can take part in. So you can have as many competitions or as many games or different organizers with competing interests. But if there is a natural limit on what players can do, you have to find a way to make that balance and to make it sustainable. Otherwise, different players will not be able to access all of the competitions. That's just going to be the reality of it. And then the other end of the conversation, and I have to say this, is there are, again, two different industries with two very different workload problems. You do not have the same workload issues in women's football that you have in men's football. There aren't the same number of competitions. There aren't the same number of teams in the various competitions as well. So perhaps global competitions in an industry where there is underload, where we know that the elite women's players aren't playing enough, maybe the solution is global competition, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it's this competition, which we know is very elite and is only for a certain percentage of the overall playing population. So again, without this proper review and consultation process that takes in the very specific starting points for each set of players in each of the industries, it's not a legitimate process. It's going to have a legitimate outcome.
Well, a fascinating way to end today's discussion. I want to say thank you, Emilio, Sarah, Maheta, for a great conversation. Looking forward to hopefully hearing from you again in short order, because I certainly learned a lot. And if you could just ask everyone for a round of applause, that would be greatly appreciated.
And Daniel, thank you to you too for chairing the discussion so brilliantly. And I think, for me, at least listening to that discussion, it's fair to say we had both sort of strong and also very reasoned voices in there. And if we've have these people with their voices more heard in the game as we move forward, we reshape the game going forward. Hopefully we are in very, very good hands. So really hope that there are some take-homes from the audience here, and we'll be checking in with these guys as football comes back after the pandemic and see how indeed it is shaping. Thank you so much, Maeta. Thank you also to Sarah and to Emilio. Please make your way off the stage, and we will continue with our program here at WFS Europe. Thank you very much indeed.